Sometimes life saves its greatest gifts for those who've been forgotten by everyone else. Clara Dean had spent years watching her dreams slip away like sand through her fingers, working endless nights in a frontier saloon where men looked right through her. Then, one stormy evening, a dying cowboy stumbled into her world and changed everything. He pressed a weathered map into her hands and told her everyone called it worthless. Clara almost threw it away that very night. But when she finally followed those hand-drawn lines into the wilderness, she found something incredible. Hidden deep in the earth was the richest diamond mine the territory had ever seen. $10 million worth of treasure that could change her life forever. But when word got out, every greedy soul came calling. Clara had to fight for what was rightfully hers. What happens when the woman everyone underestimated suddenly holds more power than anyone imagined? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Deadwater Bluff as Clara Dean swept the saloon floor for what felt like the 1,000th time in her 28 years. Dust motes danced in the amber light streaming through windows that hadn't seen a proper cleaning since the territorial governor last visited, which was never. The Copper Kettle Saloon sat at the heart of this tired frontier town, like a worn saddle on an old horse, functional but fraying at the edges. Clara paused in her sweeping, one calloused hand resting on the broom handle, while the other absently touched the small silver locket at her throat. Inside that locket was a faded photograph of her mother, Eleanor Dean, taken the day her parents bought their homestead just outside town. Her mother's eyes had held such hope then, such certainty that this wild territory would be kind to dreamers. Clara often wondered what her mother would think of her now, serving whiskey to ranch hands and listening to the same tired stories night after night. "Clara, honey, you're gonna wear a hole clean through them floorboards if you keep scrubbing like that." Martha Hendricks emerged from behind the bar, her graying hair pinned back in its usual no-nonsense bun. At 53, Martha had owned the Copper Kettle for more years than Clara had been alive, inheriting it from her late husband, who'd had the poor judgment to challenge a professional gambler to a knife fight. She was the closest thing to family Clara had left in this world, and her weathered face showed the kind of concern that came from watching someone slowly lose pieces of themselves. "Just thinking," Clara replied, continuing her methodical sweeping. "Seems like that's all I do anymore. Dangerous habit, thinking too much." Martha's voice carried the wisdom of someone who'd learned that lesson the hard way, especially when you got that look in your eyes. Same look your daddy had when he was fixing to do something foolish. Clara's father, Thomas Dean, had been many things: a dreamer, a hard worker, a man who believed that honest effort would always triumph over corruption. He'd also been spectacularly wrong about the last part. When the bank came calling with papers that somehow made their paid-off homestead legally owned by Samuel Grimes, the most powerful man in 3 counties, Thomas had fought the only way he knew how. He'd hired a lawyer from the territorial capital, spent every last cent they had on legal fees, and died of a heart attack 2 weeks before the judge ruled in Grimes' favor anyway. That was 6 years ago. Clara still felt the sharp edge of that loss, not just of her father, but of everything he'd worked to build. The homestead, the cattle, the modest but comfortable life they'd carved out of the wilderness, all of it swept away by men in expensive suits with documents that transformed justice into a purchasable commodity. "You hear anything more about that stranger from last night?" Martha asked, settling onto a bar stool with the careful movements of someone whose joints had been arguing with her for decades. Clara's hand tightened on the broom. The dying cowboy had been gone by sunrise, just as she'd expected. Men like that, broken, fevered, carrying more regret than possessions, they rarely lingered long enough to see another day. But the weight of what he'd pressed into her hands still rested heavy in the pocket of her worn dress. "Gone," she said simply, "like they always are." Shame. Had kind eyes, that one, even burning up with fever. You could see he'd been a decent sort once upon a time. Martha studied Clara's face with the sharp attention of someone who'd spent 30 years reading the moods of drunk cowboys and traveling merchants. "You seem different today. Something happened after I went to bed?" Clara considered telling her about the map. Martha deserved honesty. He'd given Clara work when no other respectable establishment would hire a woman whose family had been publicly branded as troublemakers by Samuel Grimes. She'd offered a room above the saloon when Clara had nowhere else to go, never asking for rent when times were lean, never making Clara feel like charity. But something held Clara back, some instinct that whispered this particular secret needed to be protected a while longer. "Just tired," Clara said, "same as always." The morning crowd began filtering in around 10 o'clock, the usual collection of ranch hands, traveling salesmen, and men whose primary occupation seemed to be converting whiskey into regret. Clara moved between the tables with practiced efficiency, her mind only half focused on taking orders and avoiding the wandering hands that came with the territory. The map felt like it was burning a hole through her dress pocket. 3 times she'd started to pull it out and examine it properly, and 3 times someone had needed another drink or had a complaint about the stew. By noon, her nerves were stretched tighter than a fiddle string. Clara Dean. The voice cut through the saloon's ambient noise like a blade through butter, and every conversation died as if someone had fired a gun into the ceiling. Samuel Grimes stood in the doorway, his considerable bulk filling the frame while his small, calculating eyes swept the room. At 45, he commanded respect through a combination of wealth, political connections, and the kind of ruthless ambition that had built half the territory's railroads on the backs of men who'd never lived to see their wages. His expensive suit looked out of place in the copper kettle, like a peacock preening in a chicken coop. "Mr. Grimes," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the way her heart had kicked into a gallop. "Bit early in the day for you, isn't it?" Grimes smiled, the expression holding all the warmth of a winter grave. "Heard we had some excitement last night. Strange cowboy, fevered and rambling about treasures and such. Martha mentioned you were the one who tended to him." Clara glanced at Martha, who was studiously cleaning glasses and avoiding eye contact. In a town this size, gossip traveled faster than a prairie fire, and Martha's loose tongue when she'd had a few drinks was legendary. Clara couldn't blame her. Survival in Deadwater Bluff meant staying on Samuel Grimes's good side, and information was the currency he valued most. "Poor soul was half dead when he stumbled in," Clara said. "Didn't say much that made sense. Fever talk, mostly. Still, might be worth knowing what kind of fever talk. Sometimes dying men share interesting stories." Grimes stepped fully into the saloon, his polished boots clicking against the wooden floor. "Wouldn't want any wild tales stirring up trouble in town. People get foolish ideas about treasure maps and such nonsense." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. How could he possibly know about the map? She fought to keep her expression neutral, but something must have shown in her eyes because Grimes's smile widened. "Now don't go looking at me like I got second sight, girl. It's just that desperate men tell desperate stories, and desperate stories have a way of inspiring desperate actions. I'd hate to see anyone in this town get hurt chasing fool's gold." His tone was conversational, but the threat underneath was clear as mountain water. "I appreciate your concern," Clara said, "but I think you're worrying over nothing." Man was delirious, probably dreaming about dime novels. Grimes studied her for a long moment, his gaze like cold fingers probing for weakness. Clara had the unsettling feeling that he could see right through her skin to the map tucked against her ribs. Finally, he nodded and touched the brim of his hat. "I'm sure you're right. Still, if you remember anything else about what he said, anything at all, I'd consider it a personal favor if you'd share it with me. I pay well for reliable information." After he left, the saloon remained quieter than usual, conversations resuming in hushed tones. Clara's hands shook slightly as she continued her work, but her mind was racing. Grimes knowing about maps and treasure couldn't be coincidence, which meant either Martha had told him more than she'd admitted, or there was something about that dying cowboy that ran deeper than a simple case of bad luck and worse health. That evening, after the last customer had stumbled out into the cool night air, Clara finally had her chance. She locked the front door, checked twice to make sure Martha was snoring soundly in her room upstairs, and settled at a corner table with a kerosene lamp turned low. The map emerged from her pocket like a living thing, the leather soft and warm from being pressed against her body all day. By lamplight, the hand-drawn lines seemed to shift and dance, but Clara forced herself to study them methodically. The paper was old but well cared for, the ink faded but still clearly legible. Someone had taken great care in creating this, marking elevations and geographical features with the precision of a professional surveyor. And there, in the bottom right corner, were initials that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. J.K. She'd heard those initials before, whispered in corners when men thought she wasn't listening. Jesse Kane had been Grimes's partner once, back in the early days when the territory was young and the law was whatever the strongest man said it was. The partnership had ended badly, everyone knew that much, but the details were buried under years of careful silence and strategic forgetting. Clara traced the map's route with one finger, following a path that led east through the red rock canyons toward a spot marked with a small X and the words, "God's honest truth," written in that same careful hand. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized the implications. This wasn't some dying man's fevered dream. This was Jesse Kane's final act of defiance against the man who'd probably killed him. The locket at her throat seemed to grow warm, and Clara imagined she could feel her mother's presence, urging her toward the courage that had always run thin in the Dean family blood. Thomas Dean had fought Samuel Grimes with lawyers and legal papers, and had lost everything. Maybe it was time to try a different approach. Clara carefully folded the map and tucked it back into her dress. Tomorrow, she would begin the most dangerous journey of her life. But tonight, for the first time in years, she felt something that had become almost foreign to her experience. Hope. Outside, the wind howled through Deadwater Bluff's empty streets, carrying with it the promise of change and the scent of rain. Clara smiled in the lamplight, already planning her escape from the only life she'd ever known. Clara spent the next 3 days studying the map in secret, waiting for the right moment to act. Each morning brought the same routine: sweep the floors, serve the customers, smile at their crude jokes, and count the hours until she could examine those precious, hand-drawn lines again. The more she studied them, the more convinced she became that Jesse Kane had drawn something real. The breakthrough came on Thursday morning when she discovered something that made her hands tremble with excitement. Hidden among the dying cowboy's few possessions, which Martha had bundled up and left in the back room pending someone to claim them, Clara found a surveyor's compass wrapped in oiled cloth. The brass instrument was old but well maintained, its needle true, and its engravings still sharp enough to read, "Property of J. Kane, Territorial Survey Commission, 1871. Jesse Kane hadn't just been Grimes' partner in questionable land deals. He'd been a legitimate surveyor, trained to read the land with scientific precision. The map wasn't the desperate scrawl of a dying man, it was the careful work of a professional who knew exactly what he'd found and where it could be located again. Clara held the compass up to the lamplight, watching the needle swing toward magnetic north with unwavering certainty. For the first time since her father's death, she felt like the universe might be offering her a fair chance instead of another cruel joke. The compass felt solid and real in her hands, unlike the dreams that had sustained her through 6 years of disappointment. That afternoon, while Martha dozed in her chair and the saloon lay empty in the post-lunch lull, Clara spread the map on the bar and aligned it with the compass reading. The route became clearer now, a logical progression through terrain she'd known since childhood. The path led east through Miller's Gap, then north along Willow Creek to where the Red Rock Canyons began their ancient march toward the mountains. She'd ridden that country with her father when she was younger, back when the Deans owned horses and had reason to explore beyond their property lines. Thomas Dean had been fascinated by geology, always picking up interesting rocks and spinning stories about the forces that had shaped this wild land. He'd taught Clara to read the landscape like a book, to see the stories written in stone and soil, and the way water carved its patient signature across the centuries. The X on Jessie's map marked a spot Clara remembered, a narrow canyon where her father had once found what he'd called fire rocks, stones that caught the sunlight and threw it back in brilliant flashes. They'd collected a few as curiosities, but Thomas had dismissed them as interesting but worthless. Looking at them now through the lens of Jessie Kane's careful documentation, Clara wondered if her father might have been wrong about their value. "You're planning something foolish." Martha's voice made Clara jump, nearly knocking over the kerosene lamp. The older woman stood in the doorway to her private quarters, fully awake and wearing the expression of someone who'd been watching for longer than she'd let on. Clara's first instinct was to hide the map, but something in Martha's tone stopped her. Instead, she met her friend's gaze directly, letting her see the determination that had been building for days. "Maybe," Clara admitted. "But maybe foolish is better than slow dying." Martha approached the bar with careful steps, her eyes taking in the map, the compass, and Clara's stubborn expression. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "That's Jessie Kane's compass. Recognize the engravings from when he used to drink here, back before things went bad between him and Grimes." She settled onto a bar stool, studying the map with professional interest. "This, what that dying cowboy gave you?" Clara nodded, surprised by the relief she felt at finally sharing the secret. "You think I'm crazy for believing it might be real? Honey, I've seen enough desperate men come through those doors to know the difference between fever dreams and dying confessions. That map's got the look of something a man would kill for." Martha's expression grew serious. "Question is, are you prepared for what that means?" The weight of Martha's words settled over Clara like a heavy blanket. She'd been so focused on the possibility of treasure that she hadn't fully considered the dangers. Samuel Grimes hadn't built his empire by letting opportunities slip through his fingers, and he'd already shown unusual interest in the dying cowboy's ravings. If the map led to something valuable, Clara wouldn't be the only one pursuing it. "I can't stay here, Martha. Not anymore. Every day feels like I'm disappearing a little more, becoming invisible to everyone, including myself." Clara's voice carried 6 years of accumulated frustration and grief. "My father fought Grimes with law books and lost everything. Maybe it's time to try something different." Martha was quiet for a long moment, her weathered fingers tracing the compass's brass edge. When she finally spoke, her words surprised Clara with their gentle support. "Your daddy was a good man, but he made the mistake of fighting Samuel Grimes on Grimes' terms. Law and order only work when everyone agrees to play by the same rules." She looked up at Clara with eyes that had seen too much of life's unfairness. "Sometimes a person's got to make their own rules. You think I should follow the map? I think you should be careful. But I also think you're your mother's daughter, and Eleanor Dean never backed down from a fight when she knew she was right." Martha stood, moving toward the back room where they kept supplies. "If you're determined to do this thing, we best make sure you're prepared." They spent the rest of the afternoon planning Clara's expedition. Martha contributed practical advice, born from 30 years of watching men venture into the wilderness with more hope than sense. Clara would need supplies for at least a week, enough water for the journey through dry country, and a story to explain her absence that wouldn't immediately draw suspicion. The cover story came together naturally. Clara would tell anyone who asked that she was visiting her cousin in Millerville, a town 2 days' ride in the opposite direction from where she actually planned to go. Martha would corroborate the story and handle the saloon alone, as she'd done before when Clara had taken rare sick days. As the sun set over Deadwater Bluff, Clara felt the familiar mixture of fear and excitement that came with irrevocable decisions. She was about to step off the safe, predictable path that had defined her adult life and venture into unknown territory with nothing but a dead man's map and her own desperate courage. That night, she packed her few possessions into saddlebags borrowed from Martha's late husband's gear. The map and compass went into a waterproof pouch that she would keep close to her body. Her father's old revolver, clean and loaded, found its place in a holster that felt strange but reassuring on her hip. Before dawn, Clara stood in the saloon's main room one last time, looking at the place that had been her refuge and her prison for 6 years. Dust motes danced in the early light, just as they had the day before, but everything felt different now. She was no longer Clara Dean, the saloon girl, invisible and forgotten. She was Clara Dean, the treasure hunter, about to risk everything on the word of a dying man and the precision of a brass compass. Martha emerged from her room, moving quietly in the pre-dawn stillness. She pressed a small leather bag into Clara's hand-straddling money that Clara tried to refuse, but Martha insisted she take. "For luck," Martha said simply, "and for coming back safe." Clara hugged the older woman, feeling the strength and warmth that had sustained her through the darkest years of her life. Whatever happened in the days ahead, she would carry this moment of pure friendship with her into the wilderness. The borrowed horse waiting outside was nothing special, an aging mare named Bessie, with more patience than speed, but she was sure-footed and had the endurance Clara would need for the journey ahead. As Clara settled into the saddle and pointed Bessie toward the eastern trail, she felt the weight of the compass in her pocket, like a talisman against the unknown. Behind her, Deadwater Bluff slept on, unaware that one of its most overlooked residents was riding toward a destiny that would change everything. The first day's ride took Clara through familiar country, rolling grassland, dotted with scrub oak and the occasional homestead. She kept Bessie at a steady walk, conserving the mare's strength for the harder terrain ahead, while her own eyes constantly scanned the horizon for signs of pursuit. Every dust cloud made her heart race until it resolved into cattle or wind-blown tumbleweeds. By mid-afternoon, the landscape began to change. The grass grew shorter and tougher, adapted to less water and harder ground. Red rock formations thrust up from the earth like ancient monuments, their surfaces carved by wind and weather into fantastic shapes that seemed to shift and move in the changing light. This was the country her father had loved, wild and unforgiving, but possessed of a beauty that could take your breath away if you knew how to see it. Clara stopped to rest Bessie beside a small creek where cottonwoods provided welcome shade. As the mare drank, Clara pulled out the map and compass, checking her progress against Jesse Kane's careful notations. She was making good time, but the hardest part of the journey still lay ahead. The Red Rock canyons were maze-like, full of dead ends and false trails that could confuse even experienced riders. She was studying the map when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up sharply. A lone rider was coming from the direction of town, moving at a pace that suggested purpose rather than casual travel. Clara's hand instinctively moved to her father's revolver as she watched the figure approach. The rider turned out to be a man she'd seen before but never spoken to. Lean, weather-beaten individual who sometimes drank at the copper kettle but always sat alone and paid in cash. He rode a good horse and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to living by his wits. Most people in Deadwater Bluff gave him a wide berth, though whether from fear or simple caution, Clara had never been sure. "Miss Dean," he touched his hat brim in greeting, his voice carrying a slight accent that suggested origins far from this territory. "Beautiful day for a ride in the country." Mr. Clara realized she didn't know his name, despite having served him drinks dozens of times. "Ledger, Bram Ledger." He dismounted and led his horse to the creek, moving with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent more years in the saddle than on foot. "Mind if I water my mount? It's been a long morning." Clara nodded, though every instinct told her to be wary. Men didn't ride this far from town by coincidence, and Bram Ledger had the look of someone who rarely did anything without careful consideration. "Heading to Millerville to visit family," she said, offering the cover story she and Martha had rehearsed. "Thought I'd take the scenic route." Bram's eyes held a glint of amusement, as if he could see right through her deception, but found it entertaining rather than concerning. "Millerville's the other direction, miss. Unless the map's changed since I rode through there last month." Heat rose in Clara's cheeks. She'd been so focused on following Jesse's route that she'd forgotten to maintain her cover story properly. "No need to explain yourself to me," Bram said easily, settling against a boulder while his horse drank. Every person's got a right to ride where they please, for whatever reasons suit them. I was just making conversation. Something in his tone made Clara study him more carefully. Bram Ledger might dress like a drifter and drink alone, but there was intelligence in his dark eyes and a quality of watchful patience that spoke of experience in reading people and situations. She found herself curious despite her caution. "What brings you out this way, Mr. Ledger?" "Business," he replied, then seemed to consider whether to elaborate. "The kind that involves tracking people who don't particularly want to be found. Pays well, but it's not work that makes a man popular at church socials." A bounty hunter. Clara felt her stomach tighten with new worry. Had Samuel Grimes already put a price on her head? It seemed impossibly fast, but Grimes had resources and connections that could make things happen quickly. Bram must have read her expression because he raised a hand in a peaceable gesture. "Not you, Miss Dean. My current quarry's a horse thief who lifted some prime breeding stock from a ranch down south. Been tracking him for 3 days now." Relief flooded through Clara, followed immediately by embarrassment at her obvious nervousness. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to assume." Smart woman assumes the worst until proven otherwise. Keeps her alive longer. Bram's expression grew more serious, especially when she's riding alone through country where bad things can happen to good people. There was something in his tone that made Clara wonder how much he actually knew about her situation. Bram Ledger struck her as the type of man who made it his business to know things, particularly things that other people preferred to keep secret. "I can take care of myself," she said, her hand resting meaningfully on her revolver's grip. "I'm sure you can. Your daddy taught you to shoot, I'd guess." Thomas Dean was a careful man when it came to preparing for trouble. Bram's casual mention of her father caught Clara off guard. Course, being prepared and being experienced aren't always the same thing. "You knew my father?" "Knew of him. Heard about his troubles with certain prominent citizens and how those troubles ended." Bram's voice carried genuine sympathy. Thomas Dean was an honest man, trying to fight dishonest people with honest methods. Noble, but not always effective. Clara found herself drawn into conversation, despite her wariness. There was something compelling about Bram Ledger's straightforward manner, the way he spoke hard, truths without malice or judgment. After years of being invisible in her own town, it was strange to talk with someone who seemed to actually see her. "You think there are better methods?" she asked. "I think sometimes a person has to be willing to match their opponent's level of commitment to winning. Law and order are fine concepts, but they only work when everyone agrees to honor them." Bram stood and gathered his horse's reins. "When they don't, well, that's when folks like me find steady employment." He mounted with fluid ease, settling into his saddle like it was the most natural place in the world for him to be. Clara watched him, acutely aware that this chance encounter might be more significant than it appeared. "Miss Dean," Bram said, touching his hat brim again, "I hope you find whatever you're looking for out there. But if you run into trouble, the kind of trouble that needs more than good intentions to solve, you might want to remember that some problems require specialized solutions." With that cryptic remark, he rode away, heading north along a trail that would eventually intersect with the route Clara planned to take into the canyons. She watched until he disappeared behind a red rock formation, her mind churning with questions about the encounter. Had it been purely coincidental? Bram's casual knowledge of her father's history and his pointed comments about matching opponents' commitment levels suggested otherwise. But if it hadn't been chance, who had sent him? Martha wouldn't have betrayed her confidence, and Samuel Grimes would hardly hire someone to give her cryptic warnings about dangerous methods. Clara remounted Bessie and continued eastward, but the encounter had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. The comfortable illusion that she was embarking on a simple treasure hunt had been replaced by the unsettling awareness that she was entering a game with rules she didn't understand and players whose motives remained hidden. As the afternoon wore on and the Red Rock Canyons loomed larger ahead, Clara found herself checking her back trail more frequently. The borrowed harness creaked softly with Bessie's steady gait, a rhythmic sound that had become oddly comforting during the long day's ride. The leather was old but well maintained, speaking to the careful attention that working people gave to the tools their lives depended on. By sunset, Clara had reached the entrance to the canyon country. The massive stone walls rose on either side, like the gateway to another world, their surfaces painted in shades of red and gold by the failing light. Somewhere beyond those walls lay the answer to Jessie Kane's map, and possibly the key to changing her life forever. But as she made camp in a sheltered alcove and listened to the night sounds of the wilderness, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer traveling alone. Whether that presence represented help or danger remained to be seen. Clara woke before dawn to the sound of her own heartbeat echoing off the canyon walls. The red rock formations caught the early light and threw it back in brilliant displays of color that made the landscape seem almost alive. She'd slept fitfully, every night sound amplified by the stone corridors, until even the wind seemed to carry whispered warnings. After a cold breakfast of hardtack and water, Clara consulted Jessie's map and the compass. The route led deeper into the maze of canyons, following what appeared to be an ancient watercourse that had carved its way through the rock over countless centuries. The path was clear enough for now, but Clara knew from her father's stories that these canyons could be treacherous. Flash floods had been known to sweep through without warning, and more than one experienced rider had simply vanished into the labyrinth, never to be seen again. The morning's ride took her through increasingly spectacular country. Towering walls of layered stone rose hundreds of feet on either side, their surfaces carved into fantastic shapes by wind and water. Natural arches spanned the narrow passages overhead, while hidden alcoves and side canyons branched off in all directions. Without Jessie's careful annotations, Clara would have been hopelessly lost within the first hour. Around midday, she reached a formation that made her catch her breath in wonder. A massive stone pillar rose from the canyon floor like a cathedral spire, its surface so perfectly smooth it seemed to have been polished by ancient hands. The locals called it the Echo Stone, and Clara could see why. Even the smallest sound seemed to bounce off its surface and return transformed, creating an almost musical quality to the normal noises of travel. According to the map, this was a crucial landmark. Jessie had drawn careful notations around it, indicating sight lines to other formations and compass bearings that would guide travelers deeper into the maze. Clara dismounted and walked around the base of the pillar, reading the stone like her father had taught her to do. The rock told a story spanning millions of years, layers of ancient seabeds, desert sands, and volcanic ash compressed into a history book written in stone. But there were more recent marks as well. Scratches and chips that spoke of human passage, some old enough to have been made by the territory's original inhabitants, others clearly more recent. One set of marks caught Clara's attention. Carved into the stone at eye level were initials and a date. J.K. 1873. Jessie Kane had been here, just as his map indicated. But he hadn't been alone. Other initials were carved nearby, including a set that made Clara's blood run cold. S.G. 1873. Samuel Grimes had been here too, 25 years ago. The implications hit Clara like a physical blow. This wasn't some random treasure hunt, it was connected to the partnership between Jessie Kane and Samuel Grimes, the partnership that had ended so badly that people still spoke of it in whispers. Clara studied the other carvings with new urgency. There were symbols she didn't recognize, what appeared to be survey marks, and most interesting of all, a small arrow pointing toward a narrow side canyon that wasn't marked on Jessie's map. The arrow was carved deeper than the other marks, as if someone had wanted to make absolutely sure it would endure. Following her instincts, Clara led Bessie toward the hidden passage. The opening was so narrow that the canyon walls nearly touched overhead, creating a twilight gloom even in the middle of the day. But 30 yards in, the passage opened into a circular chamber that took Clara's breath away. The walls were covered in ancient drawings, spirals, handprints, and animal figures that spoke of people who had found this place sacred long before any European had set foot in the territory. But mixed among the ancient art were more recent additions. Survey markers, elevation notations, and most remarkably, a detailed diagram of what appeared to be a mine shaft. Clara's hands trembled as she traced the modern additions. This was Jesse Kane's real work, hidden away from casual discovery, but preserved for someone who knew where to look. The diagram showed a natural cave system that had been enlarged and reinforced, with careful notes about ore quality and extraction methods. But it was the final notation that made Clara's heart race. Richest vein lies deepest. SG wanted surface extraction only. Fools rush for easy money. Real treasure requires patience and proper technique. Jesse Kane had found something extraordinary here, something valuable enough to justify the time and expense of serious mining operations. But Samuel Grimes had wanted quick profits rather than long-term development, and that disagreement had apparently ended their partnership. Clara spent an hour copying the diagrams and notations into her own notebook, working by lamplight in the ancient chamber. The silence was profound, broken only by the scratch of her pencil and the occasional sound of Bessie shifting restlessly in the narrow passage outside. When she emerged from the hidden chamber, the sun had moved significantly across the sky. Clara checked her position against Jesse's map and realized she was ahead of schedule. The secret passage had saved her hours of difficult navigation through the maze of side canyons. But as she prepared to mount Bessie and continue toward the final destination, movement on the canyon rim caught her eye. A figure on horseback was silhouetted against the sky, too distant to identify but clearly watching her progress. Clara's blood chilled as she remembered Bram Ledger's warnings about specialized problems requiring specialized solutions. She'd been followed. Clara forced herself to move normally, checking Bessie's gear and consulting the map as if she hadn't noticed the watcher. But her mind was racing through possibilities. If Samuel Grimes had sent men after her, she was trapped in a stone maze with limited options for escape. The canyon walls were too steep to climb, and the passages ahead grew increasingly narrow. The watcher disappeared behind a rock formation, but Clara knew he was still there. The feeling of being observed had become a constant pressure between her shoulder blades, making every shadow seem threatening and every sound potentially dangerous. She mounted Bessie and continued along Jesse's route, but now every decision carried new weight. Should she abandon the treasure hunt and try to escape back the way she'd come? Or push forward toward whatever Jesse Kane had found, knowing that others might be waiting? The answer came as she rounded a bend and saw fresh horse tracks in the sandy canyon floor. Someone else was following Jesse's map, and they were only hours ahead of her. The tracks showed a single horse, ridden hard and moving with purpose toward the same destination Clara sought. Clara's father had taught her to read sign almost as well as stone, and these tracks told a story that made her throat tighten with fear. The horse was shod with expensive shoes, the kind used by men who could afford the best equipment. The rider was pushing hard, stopping only when necessary and never dismounting to rest. Most telling of all, the tracks showed evidence of a pack animal. Someone was planning to carry a considerable load back from wherever Jesse's map led. Clara was no longer on a simple treasure hunt. She was racing unknown competitors toward a prize that someone thought was worth considerable risk and expense. The naive hope that she might quietly follow a dead man's map to a forgotten fortune had been replaced by the harsh reality that she was walking into a trap. But turning back wasn't an option. Behind her lay 6 years of invisible servitude and a future that stretched endlessly toward a poverty-stricken old age. Ahead lay danger, but also the possibility of changing everything. Clara urged Bessie forward into the deepening shadows of the canyon, her hand resting on her father's revolver, and her mind focused on the ancient lesson that sometimes the only way out was through. The echo stone's musical whispers followed her deeper into the maze, carrying with them the weight of choices that could not be undone. The final approach to Jesse Kane's marked location took Clara through the most treacherous terrain she'd encountered. The canyon narrowed to barely 15 feet across, its walls rising so high that only thin slices of sky were visible overhead. Loose rock made every step dangerous for Bessie, and more than once Clara had to dismount and lead the nervous mare around obstacles that could have crippled them both. The horse track she'd been following disappeared into a confusion of stone and shadow, but Jessie's map remained clear. Another half-mile through this natural bottleneck, then a sharp turn north toward what his careful notations described as the chamber where dreams become real. Clara's nerves stretched tighter with each step. The silence in these deep places was oppressive, broken only by the echo of hoofbeats and the occasional clatter of displaced stone. But it was the quality of the silence that troubled her, most the complete absence of bird calls or insect sounds that suggested something had disturbed the natural order of this place. Then she rounded the final bend and understood why. The canyon opened into a broad amphitheater surrounded by walls of red rock that rose like cathedral buttresses toward the sky. A natural spring fed a small pool at the center, its waters so clear they seemed like liquid crystal. Ancient petroglyphs covered the walls, and scattered around the spring were the remnants of old campfires and more recent excavations. But it was the modern additions that captured Clara's attention. Someone had been working here recently and extensively. A rough wooden structure covered what appeared to be a mine entrance, complete with support timbers and a primitive ore cart. Tools lay scattered around the site picks, shovels, and assaying equipment that represented a significant investment in time and money. And standing beside the mine entrance, as if he'd been waiting for her arrival, was Samuel Grimes. "Miss Dean," his voice echoed off the canyon walls with the same cold authority it carried in Deadwater, Bluff. "I was wondering when you'd arrive, though I confess I'm surprised you made it this far alone." Clara's hand moved instinctively toward her revolver, but Grimes held up a warning finger. "I wouldn't recommend that course of action. My associates are positioned where they can see every approach to this location." As if summoned by his words, two men emerged from concealment among the rocks. Clara recognized them as members of Grimes's usual entourage, hard-faced individuals who handled the kind of business that required violence rather than negotiation. Both carried rifles, with the casual competence of men accustomed to using them. "How did you?" Clara began, then stopped as understanding dawned. The map wasn't the only thing Jesse Kane left behind. Grimes smiled, the expression holding as much warmth as winter stone. "Jesse was a careful man, Miss Dean. He understood the value of insurance. When he disappeared 25 years ago, he left certain materials in the care of trusted associates. Materials that described not only the location of this remarkable find, but also the legal documentation that would establish rightful ownership." Clara felt the ground shifting beneath her feet like quicksand. Legal documentation. Mining claims, properly filed and witnessed. Survey records that establish the boundaries of what Jesse discovered here. And most importantly, a partnership agreement that clearly states my rights to any discoveries made during our association. Grimes pulled a leather portfolio from his coat and held it up for Clara to see. "All perfectly legal and binding, I assure you. But Jesse's map was never intended for you, Miss Dean. It was meant to guide his associates to this location so they could verify the claim and establish my ownership. The fact that a dying man chose to give it to a saloon girl instead of following proper procedures is regrettable, but legally irrelevant." Clara's mind raced through the implications. If Grimes had legitimate claim documents, everything she'd risked meant nothing. She would be just another trespasser on his property, with no more rights than any other claim jumper. But something about the situation didn't feel right. If Grimes truly had unassailable legal claims, why the armed men? Why the obvious nervousness she could see despite his confident words? "If your claim is so solid," Clara said carefully, "why do you need guns to enforce it?" Grimes's smile flickered slightly. "The territory can be a dangerous place, Miss Dean. One can never be too careful when dealing with valuable resources and desperate people." Clara looked around the amphitheater with new eyes, noting details she'd missed in her initial shock. The excavation work was recent but crude, showing signs of haste rather than systematic development. The scattered tools suggested multiple failed attempts rather than steady progress. Most tellingly, despite weeks or possibly months of work, there was no evidence of extracted ore anywhere in the camp. "You haven't found anything, have you?" Clara realized. "You've been digging where Jesse's original notes said to dig, but the real treasure isn't there." The flash of anger in Grimes's eyes confirmed her guess. "Jesse Kane was a professional surveyor, Miss Dean. His documentation is precise and reliable. His official documentation, maybe, but not his real secrets." Clara felt confidence growing as the pieces fell into place. "The map he gave me wasn't his first survey. It was his final one, after he'd learned things that made him break his partnership with you." Clara pulled Jesse's map from her coat, holding it where Grimes could see but not reach. "This shows the location of what he found after you parted ways. The real treasure, the one you've been looking for all these years." "That's impossible. Jesse disappeared immediately after our partnership ended. He had no opportunity for additional exploration." "Didn't he?" Clara moved closer to the mine entrance, studying the excavation with the geological knowledge her father had taught her. "This whole dig is in the wrong place. You're working surface deposits, the kind of easy extraction Jesse's notes describe. But what if those notes were deliberately incomplete?" She pointed toward a section of the canyon wall where water seepage had created distinctive mineral staining. "Look at those rock formations. See how the coloration changes along that fault line? That's not random. Something's leaching up from deep underground, following the fractures in the bedrock." Grimes stepped closer, his expression shifting from confidence to uncertainty. "You're guessing. I'm reading the stone the way my father taught me. And what it's telling me is that your excavation is barely scratching the surface of what's really here." Clara felt a moment of pure triumph as she saw doubt creep into Grimes's eyes. "Jesse Kane knew you'd want the easy money, the quick extraction that would make you rich without much effort. So he gave you exactly what you expected, to find surface deposits that would keep you busy while he explored the deeper possibilities." Clara walked toward the mineral staining, her mind working through the geological implications. The rock formations told a story of ancient underground streams and mineral deposits that had been building for thousands of years. Jesse's true map showed the way to tap into that deeper system. "The question is," Clara continued, "are you interested in what Jesse actually found? Or are you content to keep digging in the wrong place because your pride won't let you admit you've been outsmarted by a dead man?" For a long moment, the only sound in the amphitheater was the gentle splash of water from the natural spring. Then one of Grimes' men spoke up. "Boss, if she knows where the real treasure is—" "Shut up," Grimes snapped, but Clara could see him calculating odds and possibilities. His legal claims might be worthless if the real treasure lay outside the boundaries of his documented mining rights. "I'll make you a deal," Clara said, pressing her advantage. "I'll show you what Jesse's real map leads to. In exchange, you give me half of whatever we find." "Half?" Grimes laughed, but there was strain in the sound. "You're hardly in a position to negotiate, Miss Dean." Clara reached into her coat and pulled out the small diamond sample she'd discovered in the hidden chamber. She held it up to catch the light, watching Grimes's expression change as he realized what he was seeing. "This came from where Jesse's map actually leads," she said quietly. "How much have you found in 3 months of digging in the wrong place?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Clara pocketed the diamond and started walking toward the narrow passage that led deeper into the canyon system. She'd called Grimes' bluff, and now it was time to see if her own courage would hold. "Where are you going?" Grimes called after her. "To find what Jesse Kane actually discovered," Clara replied without looking back. "You can follow me and claim your half, or you can keep digging that worthless hole. Your choice." As she disappeared into the shadows, Clara heard urgent whispered conversation behind her, then the sound of boots on stone as Grimes and his men hurried to follow. She'd successfully turned the tables, but she knew the real test lay ahead. Whatever Jesse Kane had found in the deeper reaches of this canyon system, it was about to change all their lives forever. The passage Clara led them through twisted deeper into the heart of the canyon system, following fractures in the rock that spoke of geological forces beyond human comprehension. Her lamplight danced across walls that gleamed with mineral deposits, and the air carried the clean scent of underground water. Behind her, she could hear Grimes and his men struggling to keep pace. Their boots echoed off the stone walls, creating a rhythm that seemed to mock their earlier confidence. Clara smiled grimly as she realized how completely the situation had reversed. She was no longer the vulnerable saloon girl being hunted through unfamiliar territory. She was the guide leading them toward a discovery that would reshape everything. The passage opened into another chamber, smaller than the amphitheater but infinitely more significant. Jesse Kane's handiwork was evident everywhere: carefully placed support timbers, methodical excavation marks, and most importantly, a wooden stake driven deep into the stone floor with his initials carved into its surface. "This is it," Clara announced, raising her lamp to illuminate the chamber. "Jesse's real claim." The walls sparkled with embedded crystals that caught and reflected the lamplight like captured stars. But it was the exposed vein of minerals running along the chamber's far wall that took their breath away. Even in the uncertain light, the deposit was clearly massive, a ribbon of white and crystalline material that disappeared into the rock above and below. Grimes pushed past Clara, moving toward the vein with the hungry expression of a man seeing his deepest dreams made manifest. One of his men followed, while the other remained near the entrance, rifle ready. "My God," Grimes breathed, running his hands along the exposed minerals. "Jesse, you magnificent bastard." Clara watched him examine the deposit with growing satisfaction. This was what she'd gambled everything to find, not just treasure, but leverage. Grimes might have legal claims to the original site, but this chamber lay well outside any boundaries his documents could establish. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Clara said conversationally. "Jesse estimated this vein runs for at least 300 feet in both directions. At current market prices, you're looking at enough wealth to buy half the territory." "How do you know so much about Jesse's estimates?" Grimes demanded, his greedy fascination momentarily replaced by suspicion. Clara pulled out the notebook where she'd copied the diagrams from the hidden chamber. "Because Jesse was thorough. He documented everything: the geology, the extraction methods, even the legal strategies for establishing independent claims." She opened the notebook to show Grimes the technical drawings and calculations. "He knew you'd try to muscle in on anything he found, so he made sure his real discoveries were protected. This claim is properly surveyed and filed under territorial law, completely separate from your partnership agreement." Grimes' face darkened as he realized the implications. "That's impossible. Jesse disappeared before he could file anything." "Did he?" Clara asked. "Or did he just let you think he had? A man doesn't spend months doing this kind of work without protecting his interests." She moved to the wooden stake and pointed to markings carved below Jesse's initials. "Territorial claim marker, filed in Denver 3 weeks before his supposed disappearance." Jesse Kane was playing a longer game than you realized. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of approaching voices echoing through the passage behind them. Clara's blood chilled as she recognized one of the voices. It belonged to Bram Ledger. "Sounds like we're about to have company," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Grimes gestured to his men, who took positions covering the entrance. "If you've led us into a trap—" "This isn't my trap," Clara interrupted, "but it might be yours." Bram Ledger appeared in the passage entrance, moving with the easy confidence of a man who feared very little. Behind him came 2 other figures that Clara didn't recognize: alien, competent-looking men who carried themselves like professional soldiers. "Evening, folks," Bram said pleasantly. "Hope we're not interrupting anything important." Grimes stepped forward, his hand resting on his pistol. "This is private property, Ledger. You have no business here." "Funny thing about that," Bram replied, producing a document from his coat. "Seems like there's some question about exactly who owns what around here. Thought it might be worth settling before anyone does something they'd regret." Clara watched the confrontation develop with growing unease. Whatever game Bram Ledger was playing, it was more complex than a simple bounty hunt. The men with him had the look of government agents rather than hired guns. "What's your interest in this, Mr. Ledger?" Clara asked. "Professional curiosity, Miss Dean, and a certain obligation to see that territorial mining laws are properly observed." Bram's eyes swept the chamber, taking in the mineral deposits and Jesse's excavation work. "Some very important people have been asking questions about irregular claims and missing documentation. Seems like there might be some answers down here." One of Bram's companions stepped forward, revealing a territorial marshal's badge pinned to his vest. "Samuel Grimes, you're under investigation for fraudulent filing of mining claims and conspiracy to defraud territorial property rights." Clara felt the ground shift beneath her feet yet again. This wasn't about treasure hunting anymore. It was about justice, territorial law, and crimes that stretched back 25 years. "This is ridiculous," Grimes blustered. "I have proper documentation for all my claims." "Documentation that's been under scrutiny for months," the marshal replied. "Seems like a lot of your paperwork doesn't match the official territorial records. Almost like someone's been forging claims and bribing officials." Clara looked at Bram with new understanding. "You're not a bounty hunter, are you?" "Sometimes," Bram replied, "but right now I'm working for people who care about making sure territorial law means something. Jesse Kane's disappearance was never properly investigated. His claims were never properly processed, and certain powerful individuals have been profiting from that oversight for 25 years. The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. Jesse Kane hadn't just been Samuel Grimes's partner, he'd been gathering evidence of Grimes's illegal activities. His disappearance hadn't been coincidental, and his final map hadn't been about treasure at all. It had been about justice. The map was insurance, Clara realized aloud. Jesse knew Grimes would try to silence him, so he created a trail that would lead investigators to the evidence they needed. "Smart man," Bram agreed. "Too bad it took 25 years for someone to follow that trail." Grimes looked around the chamber with the desperate expression of a trapped animal. His men shifted nervously, clearly uncertain about their willingness to fight territorial marshals over their boss's illegal schemes. "You have no proof of anything," Grimes said, but his voice lacked conviction. The marshal smiled grimly. "Actually, we do. Jesse Kane left detailed records of your partnership, including documentation of forged claims, bribed officials, and at least 3 families who lost their property through fraudulent proceedings. The Dean family was just the most recent." Clara felt tears stinging her eyes as she realized the full scope of what Jesse Kane had done. He'd spent his final years gathering evidence against Samuel Grimes, knowing it would probably cost him his life, but determined to see justice done. The map he'd given her wasn't just a path to treasure, it was the key to reclaiming everything her family had lost. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now we arrest Mr. Grimes and sort out the legal ownership of about 20 mining claims and homesteads," the marshal replied, "including this one." Clara looked around the chamber that glittered with enough wealth to change her life forever. But more important than the treasure was the knowledge that her father's fight hadn't been in vain. Justice had been delayed, but it hadn't been denied. "Miss Dean," Bram said quietly, "there's something else you should know. Jesse Kane left specific instructions about this claim. If anything happened to him, it was to be held in trust for the families Grimes had defrauded. Your family's name is at the top of that list." Clara stared at the wooden stake with Jesse's initials, understanding finally that the dying cowboy's gift had been far more precious than any treasure map. He'd given her the chance to reclaim not just wealth, but justice itself. The sound of shackles closing around Samuel Grimes' wrists echoed through the chamber like the closing of a book that had been 25 years in the writing. The ride back to Deadwater Bluff took 3 days, but it felt like a journey through an entirely different world. Clara rode beside the marshal's wagon, watching Samuel Grimes sit in shackles with the stunned expression of a man whose carefully constructed empire had crumbled in the space of a single afternoon. Bram Ledger rode point, his easy competence now revealed as the professional skill of a territorial investigator rather than a simple bounty hunter. During the long hours of travel, he'd shared more of Jesse Kane's story, a tale of gradual awakening to the scope of Grimes's corruption and a methodical campaign to document evidence that could bring him down. Jesse knew he was living on borrowed time once he started gathering that evidence. Bram explained during a rest stop on the second day, but he was determined to see it through, said too many good families had been destroyed by Grimes' greed. Clara fingered the brass compass that had started this entire adventure. "How long have you known about the map?" Jesse gave copies of his key documents to 3 different people before he disappeared. "I represent the interests of one Thema lawyer in Denver who's been building a case against Grimes for years. When word came that Jesse's personal effects had surfaced in Deadwater, Bluff, I was sent to investigate. You've been watching me since I left town, making sure you stayed safe. Jesse's map was important, but not worth getting yourself killed over." Bram's expression grew serious. "Though I have to admit, you handled yourself better than anyone expected, turning the tables on Grimes in that chamber that took real courage." Clara thought about the moment when she'd faced down Samuel Grimes with nothing but Jesse Kane's map and her own desperate determination. It seemed like something that had happened to someone else, a braver version of herself that she was still getting used to inhabiting. "What happens now?" she asked. "With the mine, I mean, and the other families Grimes cheated." "That's where things get interesting," Bram replied. "Jesse's documentation is incredibly thorough. He tracked down every fraudulent claim, every forged document, every family that lost property through Grimes's schemes. The territorial government is going to have a lot of sorting to do." They crested a ridge that offered a view of Deadwater Bluff in the distance, the small town looking peaceful and unchanged, despite the revolution that was about to transform it. Clara could see smoke rising from the copper kettle's chimney, and knew Martha was probably wondering what had become of her young friend. "There's something else," Bram continued. "Something I didn't mention back in the canyon because it wasn't the right time. Jesse Kane left a personal letter along with his legal documents. It was addressed to whoever follows the map with courage enough to see justice done." Clara looked at him sharply. He knew someone would find the map. Jesse was a careful planner. He arranged for his personal effects to surface in Deadwater Bluff, specifically because he believed someone there would have the motivation to pursue justice. Bram pulled a sealed envelope from his saddlebag. "This belongs to you." With trembling fingers, Clara broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter. Jesse Kane's careful handwriting filled 2 pages with words that seemed to reach across 25 years of silence. "To the brave soul who followed my map into the canyons. If you are reading this, then Samuel Grimes has finally been brought to account for his crimes. I wish I could have lived to see that day, but some fights require more than one person to finish. I know who you probably are. Thomas Dean was a good man who tried to fight corruption with law books and honest intentions. He deserved better than what Grimes gave him. If his daughter is reading this, know that your father's fight was not in vain. It just took longer to win than either of us hoped. The mine you discovered is real, and it's worth every penny of the fortune I documented. But more important than the money is what it represents, proof that sometimes the little people can win against the powerful if they're willing to be patient and thorough and brave. I've arranged for the mine's profits to be divided among all the families Grimes cheated. Your family's share should be enough to buy back your homestead and live comfortably for the rest of your days. But I hope you'll use some of it to help others who've been stepped on by people like Grimes. The territory is changing. Law and order are coming, slowly but surely. People like your father are the reason why. Don't let anyone tell you his sacrifice didn't matter. With respect and admiration for your courage, Jesse Kane. P.S. The brass compass was my father's. He would have liked knowing it helped bring a good man's daughter home. Clara read the letter twice before the words fully sank in. Jesse Kane had planned all of this, not just the evidence gathering and the legal documentation, but the personal redemption that would restore her family's honor and future. "He knew," she whispered. "Somehow he knew it would be me." "Jesse was good at reading people," Bram said gently, and he understood that sometimes justice requires a personal touch rather than just legal procedures. As they approached the outskirts of Deadwater Bluff, Clara could see people gathering in the street. Word had already spread about the arrest of Samuel Grimes, carried by riders who'd witnessed the marshal's wagon passing through neighboring settlements. The town was buzzing with excitement and uncertainty about what Grimes' downfall would mean for everyone. Martha emerged from the copper kettle, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun as she searched the approaching group for a familiar face. When she spotted Clara, her expression transformed from worry to relief to something approaching pride. "Clara Dean," she called out, "you look different, taller somehow." Clara dismounted and embraced her friend, feeling the weight of the past week settling around her like a heavy coat that no longer fit properly. She was different, no longer the invisible saloon girl who swept floors and served drinks to men who looked through her. She was Clara Dean, the woman who'd followed a dead man's map to justice and treasure. "I have some stories to tell you," Clara said. "I expect you do, and I expect the whole town's going to want to hear them." Martha glanced toward the marshal's wagon, where Samuel Grimes sat in obvious defeat. "Though I suspect some of those stories are going to change a lot of lives around here." Clara looked around the town that had been her prison for 6 years, seeing it now with eyes that understood how much was about to change. Families would get their land back. Honest people would no longer live in fear of Grimes's retaliation. And somewhere in the Red Rock Canyons, a mine full of diamonds waited to fund a future that Jesse Kane had envisioned but never lived to see. The forged documents that had stolen her family's homestead were about to be exposed as the worthless papers they'd always been. But more than that, the corruption that had made such theft possible was being rooted out and destroyed. Clara fingered Jesse Kane's compass, feeling its solid weight as a reminder that patience and planning could accomplish what anger and desperation could not. Her father had fought the good fight and lost. But his daughter had finished what he started, guided by a dead man who'd understood that justice delayed was not necessarily justice denied. As the marshal's wagon continued toward the town jail, Clara walked beside it with her head held high. The invisible saloon girl was gone forever, replaced by a woman who'd stared down corruption and won. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as lawyers and territorial officials sorted through 25 years of fraudulent claims. But tonight, Clara Dean was going home. 2 weeks after Samuel Grimes' arrest, Deadwater Bluff hummed with an energy Clara had never experienced. Territorial officials had arrived from Denver to oversee the investigation, and the usually quiet town had become a center of legal activity that attracted lawyers, journalists, and opportunists from across the region. Clara found herself at the center of it all, her small room above the copper kettle transformed into an unofficial headquarters where families gathered to share their stories of loss and hope for restitution. Each day brought new revelations as Jesse Kane's meticulous documentation exposed the full scope of Grimes's criminal enterprise. The Hendersons had lost their cattle ranch to forged debt papers. The Martinez family had been driven off their homestead by falsified boundary surveys. 3 different mining claims had been stolen through bribed officials and backdated documents. The pattern repeated with sickening consistency. Honest families destroyed by a system that had been corrupted from within. 37 families, Clara said to Martha as they tallied the latest reports. 37 families cheated out of their livelihoods over 25 years. Martha shook her head in disgust. And that's just what we know about so far. Lord knows how many others packed up and left without ever understanding what really happened to them. Clara walked to the window, overlooking the main street, where she could see territorial marshals coming and going from the improvised courthouse they'd established in the hotel. Each day brought new evidence, new witnesses, and new complications as the investigation expanded beyond simple fraud into a web of corruption that reached into the territorial capital. "Miss Dean?" A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "It's Marshal Davidson. Could I have a word?" Clara opened the door to find the lead investigator holding a thick folder of documents. Marshal Davidson was a competent man in his 50s who'd spent 3 decades enforcing territorial law, but even his extensive experience seemed challenged by the scope of what they'd uncovered. "We need to talk about the mine," he said without preamble, "and about some decisions you're going to have to make." Clara gestured him to a chair, her stomach tightening with apprehension. For 2 weeks, she'd been so focused on helping other families understand their rights that she'd barely had time to process the implications of her own situation. "The geological survey teams finished their assessment yesterday," Davidson continued. "Jesse Kane's estimates were conservative, if anything. That diamond deposit is one of the richest ever documented in the territory. We're talking about enough wealth to fund territorial development for the next 50 years. That's good news, isn't it?" "It's complicated news. See, word's gotten out despite our best efforts to keep things quiet. Denver's full of investors and mining companies asking questions about development rights. And some of those investors have connections to people in Washington who might not appreciate seeing this much wealth controlled by local interests." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that powerful people have a way of finding legal justifications for taking what they want. Your claim is solid. Jesse Kane made sure of that. But solid claims have been overturned before when enough money and political pressure get applied." Davidson leaned forward, his expression serious. "There's talk of invoking territorial development statutes that would allow the government to take control of the mine for strategic resource management. It would mean compensation for you and the other families, but nowhere near the actual value of what you found." Clara sank into her chair as the implications hit her. Just when justice seemed within reach, new threats were emerging from directions she'd never considered. "How long do we have?" "Hard to say. The territorial governor's been asking pointed questions about the situation here, and there's a delegation of federal officials heading this way from Washington. Could be days, could be weeks. What can we do?" "That depends on how far you're willing to go to protect what's yours." Davidson's tone suggested he'd given this considerable thought. "Jesse Kane's documentation gives you legal standing, but legal standing only matters if you can defend it, and defending something this valuable against federal pressure that takes more than paperwork." A commotion in the street below drew Clara's attention back to the window. A group of riders was approaching the town, their dust cloud visible from miles away. But these weren't the careful, methodical movements of territorial officials. This group rode with the urgency of men on a mission. "Expecting anyone?" Davidson asked, joining her at the window. Clara counted at least 20 riders, all well-armed and moving in formation. At their head rode a man she recognized from newspaper illustrations, Jonathan Sterling, one of Denver's most powerful mining magnates, and a man known for getting what he wanted regardless of legal niceties. "Trouble," Clara said simply. Davidson cursed under his breath. "Sterling's got connections all the way to Washington. If he's here in person, it means someone's decided to move fast on taking control of your mine." Clara watched the riders approach with a mixture of fear and anger. For 2 weeks, she'd believed that justice was finally being served, that the little people could win if they had truth and law on their side. Now she was learning that truth and law were just opening moves in a game that powerful people played by different rules. "Marshal, I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer." Clara turned from the window to face Davidson directly. "If it comes down to a fight between territorial law and federal pressure, which side will you be on?" Davidson was quiet for a long moment, studying Clara's face as if trying to read her character. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard experience. "I've spent 30 years watching powerful people take what they want from folks who can't fight back. Told myself it was just the way things worked, that law and order meant following whoever had the biggest stick." He stood and moved toward the door. "But sometimes a situation comes along that makes you remember why you pinned on a badge in the first place. Is that a yes?" "That's a promise that territorial law means something in this territory, regardless of who doesn't like it." Davidson paused at the door. "But Miss Dean, you need to understand what you're up against." Sterling doesn't just have money and political connections. He's got men who specialize in making problems disappear. If you're going to fight this, you better be prepared for it to get ugly. After he left, Clara stood alone in her room, looking out at the approaching riders and feeling the weight of decisions that would affect not just her own future, but the futures of 37 families who'd already lost everything once. Jessie Kane's brass compass sat on her dresser, its needle pointing steadily north toward the certainty she needed to find within herself. Martha appeared in the doorway, her face grim with understanding. Those riders don't look like they're here for a social visit. No, they don't. Clara moved to her dresser and opened the bottom drawer, pulling out her father's Winchester rifle. Thomas Dean had taught her to shoot when she was 12, emphasizing that sometimes a person had to be willing to defend what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible. "You're not seriously thinking of fighting Jonathan Sterling," Martha said. "I'm thinking about what my father would do, what Jessie Kane would do." Clara checked the rifle's action, muscle memory, guiding her hands through the familiar motions. They believed that right was right, regardless of who disagreed. "They're both dead, honey. But their fight isn't finished." Clara looked out the window again, watching Sterling's men spread out through the town with the precision of a military operation. Maybe it's time someone finished it for them. Martha was quiet for a moment, then moved to the window herself. 43 years I've lived in this town. 43 years of watching good people get stepped on by folks with more money and fewer scruples. Always told myself it wasn't my fight. She turned to Clara with an expression of grim determination. "But I reckon it is now. What do you need me to do?" Clara felt a surge of affection for the woman who'd been more than a friend, who'd been the family she'd needed when everything else was stripped away. "Help me send word to the other families. If Sterling wants to steal what we've reclaimed, he's going to have to do it in front of the whole territory. And if he's willing to do that..." Clara picked up Jessie Kane's compass, feeling its solid weight as a reminder of the courage that had brought her this far. "Then we'll remind him that some things are worth fighting for, no matter what the cost." As Sterling's riders took positions throughout the town, Clara began preparing for the most important fight of her life. She'd followed a dying man's map to justice and treasure, but now she would have to prove that she was worthy of both. The invisible saloon girl was gone forever, replaced by a woman who understood that sometimes the only way to protect what you've won is to be willing to risk everything defending it. Outside, Jonathan Sterling dismounted in front of the hotel, his expensive clothes and confident bearing marking him as a man accustomed to getting his way. But Clara Dean was no longer the kind of woman who stepped aside for powerful men. The final confrontation was about to begin. The confrontation began at dawn the next morning when Jonathan Sterling knocked on the door of Clara's room with the polite insistence of a man who expected immediate compliance with his wishes. "Miss Dean, I believe we have business to discuss." Sterling's voice carried the smooth authority of someone accustomed to negotiating from positions of overwhelming strength. "May I come in?" Clara had spent the night preparing for this moment, cleaning her father's rifle and reviewing Jessie Kane's legal documents one final time. She opened the door to find Sterling, flanked by two well-dressed men who had the predatory stillness of professional enforcers disguised as lawyers. "Mr. Sterling, I was wondering when you'd get around to introducing yourself." Clara stepped aside to let them enter, noting how Sterling's eyes immediately catalogued everything in the room: the rifle, the legal papers, the brass compass that represented her connection to Jessie Kane's legacy. "I'll be direct, Miss Dean. I represent interests that are prepared to offer you substantial compensation for your mining claim. More money than you could spend in 3 lifetimes, with no legal complications or lengthy development delays." Sterling settled into the room's single chair as if he owned it. "All you have to do is sign some papers and walk away wealthy." "And if I don't?" Sterling's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Then you'll discover that territorial mining law can be surprisingly complex when examined by federal authorities." Environmental concerns, strategic resource classifications, imminent domain proceedings, these things have a way of making even the most legitimate claims disappear into bureaucratic tangles that last for decades. Clara moved to the window, looking down at the street where Sterling's men had positioned themselves with military precision. Martha was visible in the doorway of the copper kettle, her weathered face set with determination. Other townspeople had emerged from their homes and businesses, creating an audience for whatever was about to unfold. "You know what I find interesting, Mr. Sterling?" Clara turned back to face her uninvited guests. "You rode all the way here from Denver with 20 armed men to make me an offer. That seems like a lot of trouble for a simple business transaction." "The territory can be dangerous. One can never be too careful. Or maybe you're not as confident in your legal position as you pretend to be." Clara picked up Jesse Kane's compass, using its solid weight to steady her nerves. "Because if you could simply take what you wanted through official channels, you wouldn't need to intimidate a saloon girl in a frontier town." One of Sterling's companions leaned forward with obvious irritation. "Miss Dean, you're in no position to negotiate. Mr. Sterling is offering you more consideration than the law requires." "Actually, I think I'm in exactly the position I need to be in." Clara opened Jesse Kane's folder of documents, selecting a particular page that she'd studied carefully during her sleepless night. "Did you know that Jesse Kane filed mineral rights claims on 17 different sites throughout this canyon system? Not just the main deposit, but every significant geological formation within a 20-mile radius." Sterling's expression flickered with the first hint of uncertainty she'd seen. "That's impossible. Our research indicates—" "Your research missed quite a bit, apparently." Jesse Kane was a professional surveyor who understood that controlling a major resource meant controlling all access routes and supporting infrastructure. Clara spread several survey maps across her small table. Every trail into the canyon, every water source, every feasible location for processing facilities, Jesse claimed them all. She traced the boundaries with her finger, showing Sterling how completely Jesse had locked up the entire region. "Even if you could challenge my claim to the main deposit, you'd still need access agreements for basic operations. And those agreements would have to be negotiated with 37 different families who now hold legitimate titles to Jesse's subsidiary claims." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of horses in the street below. Clara looked out to see Marshal Davidson arriving with a dozen territorial deputies, their badges glinting in the morning sunlight. But more significantly, families from across the region were beginning to gather: the Hendersons, the Martinez family, and dozens of others who'd lost everything to Samuel Grimes' schemes. "It appears you have support," Sterling observed, his tone suggesting this was a minor inconvenience rather than a serious obstacle. "I have justice," Clara replied, "and apparently that's something people are willing to fight for." Sterling stood, smoothing his expensive coat with movements that seemed calculated to demonstrate his complete lack of concern. "Miss Dean, you're making this far more complicated than necessary. There are forces at work here that go well beyond territorial politics. National interests, strategic considerations that a woman in your position couldn't possibly understand. Try me. The federal government has determined that this mineral deposit is too valuable to remain under local control. There are infrastructure projects, military applications, strategic reserves to consider. Your little claim represents a threat to national security that simply cannot be tolerated." Clara felt the ground shifting beneath her feet yet again, but this time she was prepared for it. Jesse Kane's final lesson was becoming clear: powerful people always found new justifications for taking what they wanted, but the response had to remain constant. "Mr. Sterling, I appreciate you explaining the situation so clearly. Now, let me explain mine." Clara moved to her dresser and picked up a leather satchel that contained copies of every document in Jesse Kane's collection. "This contains evidence of criminal conspiracy, fraud, and corruption that reaches from Deadwater, Bluff to Washington. Every forged claim, every bribed official, every family destroyed by illegal land grabs, it's all documented in meticulous detail." She held up a particular bundle of papers. including some very interesting correspondence between Samuel Grimes and certain federal officials about manipulating mining regulations for personal profit. Jesse Kane was thorough about documenting all his business relationships. Sterling's facade of calm control cracked slightly. "You're bluffing." "Am I? Would you like me to read some of the more interesting passages? There's a lovely letter from 1871 where a certain territorial administrator promises to expedite claim approvals in exchange for stock options in Grimes' mining ventures." The room fell silent, except for the sound of voices from the street below. Clara could hear Martha organizing the gathering crowd, directing families to strategic positions throughout the town. Whatever Sterling had planned, he would have to execute it in front of witnesses who understood exactly what was at stake. "Miss Dean," Sterling said carefully, "you're playing a very dangerous game with forces you don't understand." "No, Mr. Sterling, I understand perfectly." Clara slung the rifle over her shoulder and picked up the satchel of documents. "You're used to dealing with people who have something to lose. But I spent 6 years losing everything piece by piece until I had nothing left but the courage to fight back. That makes me the most dangerous kind of opponent, with nothing left to lose and everything to gain." She moved toward the door, pausing to look back at Sterling and his companions. "You have 1 hour to pack up your men and leave Deadwater Bluff. After that, copies of Jesse Kane's complete documentation go to every newspaper and federal investigator between here and Washington. Let's see how your national security arguments hold up when the whole country knows what you're really after." As Clara walked downstairs toward the confrontation that would determine everything, she felt the weight of Jesse Kane's compass in her pocket and her father's rifle across her back. The invisible saloon girl was gone forever, replaced by a woman who understood that sometimes the only way to defeat corruption was to drag it into the light where everyone could see it clearly. The street in front of the Copper Kettle had transformed into an impromptu town square where the future of Deadwater Bluff would be decided. Families from across 3 counties had gathered, their faces showing the mix of hope and determination that came from finally having a chance to reclaim what had been stolen from them. Clara emerged from the saloon to find Marshal Davidson coordinating with his deputies while keeping a careful eye on Sterling's positioned men. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, but it was the kind of tension that came before justice rather than violence. "Miss Dean," Davidson called out, "might want to see this before you make any final decisions." He handed her a telegram that had arrived minutes earlier from the territorial capital. Clara read it twice before the full implications sank in. "Federal investigation, initiated into territorial mining. Corruption, stop. Sterling Enterprises under criminal investigation. Stop. Do not negotiate under duress. Stop. Martial jurisdiction confirmed. Stop." "Seems like Jesse Kane's documentation reached some important people in Denver," Davidson explained. "Turns out there have been questions about Sterling's business practices for months. Your evidence was exactly what they needed to move forward." Clara looked across the street to where Sterling stood, conferring urgently with his men. The confident businessman who'd entered her room an hour earlier now showed signs of a man whose carefully laid plans were unraveling in real time. Martha appeared at Clara's elbow, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone watching bullies get their comeuppance. Words spreading fast. "Seems like half the territory's been waiting for someone to stand up to Sterling and his kind." "Miss Dean," Sterling's voice cut across the murmur of the gathering crowd, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Perhaps we could discuss this situation more privately." Clara stepped into the middle of the street, positioning herself where everyone could see and hear clearly. The moment felt like something from the stories her father used to tell about the old days, when disputes were settled in town squares, with the whole community as witness. "No more private discussions, Mr. Sterling. Whatever you have to say, you can say it in front of everyone here." Clara's voice carried clearly in the morning air. "These people have a right to know what kind of deals you were planning to make with their property." Sterling's face flushed with anger, but he was too experienced a businessman to lose control completely. "Miss Dean, you're making a serious mistake. There are aspects of this situation that go beyond your local concerns." "Such as?" such as the fact that your friend Jesse Kane wasn't the innocent victim you believe him to be. Sterling pulled out a folder of his own, his movements sharp with frustration. Jesse Kane was a federal agent, Miss Dean. Everything he did here was part of a government investigation into territorial corruption. The revelation hit Clara like a physical blow. Around her, she could hear the confused murmur of the crowd as they tried to process this new information. "You're lying," Clara said. But even as the words left her mouth, pieces began falling into place in ways that made terrible sense. "Am I? A simple surveyor doesn't have access to the kind of legal resources Kane used to document Grimes's activities. A simple surveyor doesn't file mining claims in 17 different jurisdictions simultaneously. And a simple surveyor certainly doesn't have the connections to ensure his evidence reaches federal investigators 25 years after his death." Sterling's smile was triumphant and cold. Jesse Kane was using Samuel Grimes to expose a network of territorial corruption that reached all the way to Washington. When Grimes became suspicious, Kane had to disappear, but he made sure his investigation would continue even after his death. Clara felt the compass in her pocket like a weight of betrayal. Had everything been a lie? Had Jesse Kane manipulated her just as surely as Sterling was trying to do now? But then she remembered the letter Jesse had left for her, the personal words that spoke of her father's courage and her own strength. Whatever else Jesse Kane might have been, his respect for her family had been genuine. "Even if that's true," Clara said, finding her voice again, "it doesn't change what's right. These families lost their homes and livelihoods to criminal fraud. They deserve justice regardless of who exposes the corruption." "Justice?" Sterling laughed harshly. "Miss Dean, you're holding evidence in a federal investigation. That makes you a material witness, not a property owner. Everything you think you've won can be confiscated as evidence in ongoing criminal proceedings." Clara looked around at the faces of the families who'd gathered to support her cause. She saw the fear creeping back into their eyes as Sterling's words reminded them how powerless they'd always been against people with money and connections. But she also saw something else, the same stubborn determination that had driven her to follow Jesse's map into the wilderness. These people had come here not because they believed they could win, but because they believed fighting was better than surrendering. "Marshal Davidson," Clara called out, "you've been enforcing territorial law for 30 years. In your professional opinion, does federal jurisdiction override legitimate territorial mining claims?" Davidson stepped forward, his badge catching the sunlight as he faced Sterling directly. "Not without proper legal proceedings, it doesn't. And those proceedings require evidence of criminal activity by the claimants themselves, not just by previous property owners." "There's no criminal activity here," Clara continued, her confidence returning as she understood the battle they were really fighting. Jesse Kane's investigation exposed corruption, but it also established that every family here has legitimate ownership rights that were stolen through fraud. Federal investigation or not, those rights have to be restored. Sterling's expression darkened as he realized his leverage was slipping away. "You don't understand the forces you're dealing with, Miss Dean. This goes far beyond territorial law." "Then maybe it's time those forces learned something about territorial justice." Clara pulled Jesse Kane's compass from her pocket, holding it up where everyone could see. This compass belonged to a man who spent years gathering evidence to protect innocent families from corruption. Whether he was a federal agent or a simple surveyor doesn't matter. What matters is that he was right about what needed to be done. She looked around at the gathered crowd, seeing nods of agreement and growing determination. "Mr. Sterling, you came here expecting to intimidate a bunch of farmers and small-town folk into giving up their rights. But you made the same mistake Samuel Grimes made. You underestimated people who have nothing left to lose and everything to fight for." Clara walked towards Sterling, stopping just outside arm's reach. "You have 15 minutes to pack up your men and leave Deadwater Bluff. After that, Marshal Davidson will arrest you for conspiracy to defraud territorial property rights. And I'll make sure every newspaper in the country knows exactly what kind of national security you were really protecting." Sterling stared at her for a long moment, his cold calculation warring with frustrated anger. Finally, he signaled to his men with sharp, angry gestures. "This isn't over, Miss Dean. There are bigger games being played here than you could possibly understand." "Maybe," Clara replied, "but this particular game is finished, and you lost." As Sterling and his men mounted their horses and rode out of Deadwater Bluff, Clara felt the weight of victory settle around her like a warm blanket. Jesse Kane's final letter had been right. Sometimes the little people could win against the powerful if they were willing to be patient and thorough and brave. The compass in her hand pointed steadily north toward the future she'd won for herself and 37 families who would finally have justice. 6 months later, Clara Dean stood on the front porch of the homestead that had been stolen from her family and restored by the courage to follow a dying man's map. The house needed work. 6 years of neglect had taken their toll, but the bones were solid, and the view across the valley remained as beautiful as she remembered from childhood. The mine had proven even richer than Jesse Kane's estimates. Professional extraction crews were pulling diamonds from the canyon walls at a rate that had transformed Deadwater Bluff from a forgotten frontier town into one of the territory's most prosperous communities. More importantly, the profits were being shared among the 37 families that had been cheated by Samuel Grimes, ensuring that the wealth would benefit the people who'd suffered most from his corruption. "Clara, you've got visitors," Martha called from the kitchen where she was supervising the installation of a new wood-burning stove. Martha had sold the copper kettle to a young couple from Denver and accepted Clara's invitation to help manage the homestead. At 54, she'd discovered she enjoyed the challenge of bringing an abandoned property back to life. Clara walked to the front door to find Bram Ledger dismounting from his horse with the easy grace that had marked all his movements. Behind him rode a woman. Clara didn't recognize an older lady with silver hair and the kind of understated elegance that spoke of education and refinement. "Miss Dean." Bram touched his hat brim with the familiar gesture that had become as much a part of their friendship as his cryptic comments and unexpected insights. "I'd like you to meet Mrs. Eleanor Kane, Jesse's daughter." Clara felt her breath catch. Jesse Kane had never mentioned family in any of his documentation, but looking at Mrs. Kane's face, she could see the resemblance in the intelligent eyes and the stubborn set of the jaw. "Miss Dean, I've been wanting to meet you for months," Mrs. Kane said as she approached the porch. "My father's letters spoke of you with such admiration." "His letters?" "The ones he wrote to me during his final years, explaining what he was trying to accomplish and why it mattered so much to him." Mrs. Kane pulled an envelope from her traveling bag, including this one, which he asked me to deliver personally when everything was finished. Clara accepted the letter with trembling hands, recognizing Jesse Kane's careful handwriting on the envelope that was addressed simply to Clara Dean, the woman who finished the fight. Inside, she found a single page that contained Jesse's final message. "Clara, if Eleanor is delivering this letter, it means you succeeded in ways that go far beyond following a map or finding treasure. You took the courage your father gave you and used it to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. That's the kind of victory that changes the world, one person at a time. The compass I gave you belonged to my father, who taught me that a man's true measure isn't in what he achieves for himself, but in what he makes possible for others. I hope you'll keep it as a reminder that some fights are worth everything you have to give. Your father would be proud of the woman you've become. More importantly, you should be proud of yourself. With deepest respect, Jesse Kane, P.S. The mine was never the real treasure. The real treasure was proving that justice still matters when good people are brave enough to fight for it. Clara read the letter twice before looking up to find Mrs. Kane watching her with understanding eyes. "He planned all of this, didn't he?" Clara asked. "Not just the investigation, but everything that followed. My father believed that the right person in the right circumstances could accomplish things that seemed impossible." Mrs. Kane replied. "He spent his final years arranging those circumstances and waiting for the right person to discover them. Bram stepped onto the porch, his expression carrying the satisfaction of a job well completed. Jesse left detailed instructions about how his investigation should proceed after his death. But he also left specific guidance about recognizing someone with the character to see it through properly. You were watching me from the beginning, making sure you stayed safe and had the support you needed, but the choices were always yours to make. Bram looked out across the valley toward the canyon country where Clara's adventure had begun. Jesse believed that real change came from individuals willing to risk everything for what they knew was right. You proved him correct. Clara fingered Jesse Kane's compass, feeling its familiar weight as a reminder of how far she'd traveled from the invisible saloon girl who'd served drinks and swept floors while dreaming of a different life. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been moments of fear and doubt that had tested every ounce of courage she possessed. But the results spoke for themselves. 37 families were rebuilding their lives on land that had been rightfully restored to them. Samuel Grimes was serving a 20-year sentence in territorial prison. The corruption that had poisoned the region's development for decades had been exposed and eliminated. And Deadwater Bluff had become a symbol of what was possible when ordinary people refused to accept injustice. "There's something else," Mrs. Kane said, producing another document from her bag. "My father established a trust fund for continuing the work he started, investigating territorial corruption, helping families recover stolen property, ensuring that the law means something to everyone regardless of their wealth or connections." She handed Clara the document. "He wanted you to oversee that trust, if you're willing." Clara looked at the papers that would formalize her transformation from victim to advocate, from someone who suffered injustice to someone who fought it wherever it existed. The trust fund was substantial enough to support investigations across the entire territory, funded by Jesse Kane's careful investments and the ongoing profits from the diamond mine. "Why me?" "Because you understand what it means to lose everything and still find the courage to fight back." Mrs. Kane replied, "And because my father believed that the best advocates for justice are people who've experienced injustice personally." Clara walked to the porch railing, looking out across the land that had been stolen from her family and reclaimed through courage, persistence, and the guidance of a dead man who'd understood that some fights required more than one generation to finish. The valley stretched toward the Red Rock Canyons, where her adventure had begun, the stone formations glowing in the afternoon light, like monuments to the patience required for true justice. "I'll need help," Clara said finally. "This is bigger than anything one person can handle alone." "You'll have it," Bram promised. "And you'll have the backing of federal authorities who've learned that territorial corruption is a national problem requiring local solutions." Clara smiled, remembering the frightened woman who'd almost thrown Jesse's map into the fire rather than risk following it into the unknown. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that the greatest treasures weren't found in the ground, but in the courage to stand up for what was right, regardless of the consequences. "Then I accept," she said, taking the compass from her pocket one final time. Its needle pointed steadily north, toward whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead. Clara Dean had followed a dying man's map to justice and treasure, but more importantly, she'd discovered that the real map was the courage to keep fighting when fighting seemed impossible. As the sun set over the valley that was finally home again, Clara began planning her next campaign against the corruption that still plagued too many corners of the territory. Jesse Kane's fight was finished, but Clara Dean's fight was just beginning. The invisible saloon girl was gone forever, replaced by a woman who'd learned that some treasures were worth everything you had to give, and that the most precious treasure of all was the knowledge that justice still mattered when good people were brave enough to demand it.